The biggest mistake you can make when hiring a private investigator happens before the investigator ever works the first hour of your case. And surprisingly, it's something I see all the time. A client calls an investigator and immediately starts telling them what they want done. I need you to follow my spouse. I need you to find this person. I need you to interview this witness. I need you to get photographs. I need 20 hours of surveillance and 6 helicopters in the air. But here's the problem. You're telling the investigator what you want them to do before you've explained what the problem you're actually trying to solve is. And those are two completely different things. I've been involved in investigations for roughly 30 years. And one of the first questions I always ask a client is, what is your end goal? What are you trying to accomplish? What information do you need? What evidence already exists? And most importantly, what are you going to do with the information once you have it? Because an investigation should never begin with simply performing a task. It should begin with developing a strategy. And sometimes it also requires having to have a very difficult conversation with the client. I'll give you an example. When someone comes to me wanting to investigate a spouse for possible infidelity, one of the first things I explain to them is this. You need to understand that once you hire a private investigator to investigate your spouse, there may be no going back. It doesn't matter whether we discover that your spouse is cheating or whether we discover absolutely nothing at all. Because if your spouse ever finds out that you hired a private investigator to follow them, photograph them, and investigate their activities, your relationship may never be the same again. And that's something I believe the client needs to seriously consider before the investigation ever begins. So I ask them, are you aware of that? And can you deal with the consequences if that happens? Because my job as an investigator isn't to tell someone whether they should stay married or get divorced. That's not my decision to make. But I do believe it's my responsibility to make sure the client understands that an investigation itself can have consequences. Even if we find absolutely nothing, that goes back to the question I asked in the beginning. What is your end goal? Because if you haven't thought about what you're going to do with the information once you have it, you may not be ready to begin the investigation. Now let me give you another example. Someone calls a private investigator and says, I need you to conduct surveillance on this person. Okay. Why? What are we trying to determine? Where they go? Who they meet? Where they work? Whether they're living at a particular address? Whether they're violating a court order? Whether they're engaging in some type of activity that's relevant to an already in process lawsuit. Because the answer to that question completely changes how I approach the investigation. Sometimes surveillance is absolutely the right tool, but sometimes it isn't. There are situations where a client could spend thousands of dollars on a surveillance trying to learn something that could have easily been discovered through a properly conducted background investigation, social media investigation, database research, public records, or simply interviewing the right person. That's why one of the biggest differences between hiring someone to perform an investigative task and hiring an experienced investigator is strategy. A good investigator should be asking questions. What do we know? What don't we know? What can we prove? And what do we need to prove? And what is the most efficient and legally defensible way to get from where we are now to where we need to be? The same thing applies to witness interviews. A client may say, I need you to go interview this witness. Fine, we can do that. But before I interview that witness, I want to know what evidence already exists. Are there police reports, photographs, video, prior statements, other witnesses, or maybe even court documents? Because interviewing someone too early could, without understanding the evidence, can create problems. You may ask the wrong questions. You may fail to recognize inconsistencies in their current statement. You may unintentionally reveal information that the witness didn't previously know. Or you may walk away thinking you conducted a successful interview when you completely missed the target and the most important information that person had. Investigations should be conducted in a logical order, and that order should be determined by the objective of the case. This is also one of the reasons I strongly recommend that in cases involving litigation, the attorney and the investigator work together. The attorney understands the legal issues. The investigator understands how to develop information and evidence. And when those two work together and develop a strategy before the investigation begins, you're far more likely to get useful results and potentially save the client a significant amount of money. And, well, that's always a good thing. Because here's something people sometimes misunderstand about private investigators. Our job isn't simply to generate billable hours, or at least it shouldn't be. Our job is to solve problems. Sometimes that requires surveillance. Sometimes it requires interviews. Sometimes it simply requires records research. Sometimes it requires locating a witness. And sometimes the most important thing an experienced investigator can tell you is, don't spend your money doing that quite yet, because there's something else we need to do first. Experience teaches you that the most obvious investigative approach isn't always the best one. The client usually knows the problem better than anyone. The attorney understands the legal objective, and the investigator understands how to develop the information and evidence necessary to connect the two. That's where investigative strategy comes into play. So if you're considering hiring a private investigator, don't begin the conversation by simply saying, I need 20 hours of surveillance with 6 helicopters and 5 cars. I need you to interview this person. Instead, explain the situation. Explain what you know. Explain what you don't know. Explain what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. And be prepared for the investigator to ask you some difficult questions, because a good investigator shouldn't just be thinking about how to conduct the investigation. No, sir. They should also be thinking about what happens when the investigation is over. Remember this. There's a big difference between hiring someone to perform an investigative task and hiring an investigator to help solve a problem. Don't hire an investigator and tell him how many hours you want. Tell him what problems you need solved. Tell him what your end goal is, and then let him investigate. My name is Andy Crutchfield, and I'm with Advanced Protective Services here in Kennesaw, Georgia. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button. It's right over here. And don't forget to hit that bell so that you'll be notified whenever we do an upload. And we do one each and every week. Until next time, have a great day.